I call Andrew Williams.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I take a call on behalf of New Zealand First for the Appropriation 2011-12 Supplementary Estimates Bill. Mr Speaker, we heard from the member from Dipton, otherwise known as the Double Dipper from Dipton, and what a disappointing speech. What a disappointing speech. Mr Speaker, New Zealanders are increasingly feeling that this government seems to be just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Basically, they're just playing around on the fringes, playing around on the edges, but at the end of the day, Mr Speaker, really not making a quantum change for New Zealand to take New Zealand forward, to grow the pie, to grow the economy, to grow jobs, to grow opportunities in New Zealand, to grow business in New Zealand. They really are just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Mr Speaker, the National Party inherited 7 or 8 years of surpluses and immediately took this country into deficit. They started with an $8 billion debt. They started with an $8 billion debt. Today we're in excess of $52 billion some 3.5 years later. How does anyone run a company? How does anyone run a household? How does anyone run anything where you take the debt from $8 billion to $52 billion plus in 3.5 years? And where they're not even saying that's the end of it, where they're saying, oh, and it's worse to come, in another 2 or 3 years we'll be over $70 billion in debt. No wonder New Zealanders are increasingly saying, what have we let loose here? What have we let loose here? A government that basically really is inept. They keep promising, Mr Speaker, that frontline services won't be cut. And there's all this rhetoric about frontline services not being cut. And yet, week by week, all we hear about are more 0800 numbers being started up by the various government departments and ministries, more and more call centres being set up, half of which I don't even think are in New Zealand, to service the needs of New Zealanders. I have constituents who say that now they wait on the telephone. They wait on the telephone for 45 minutes to try and get a response from a department. And that's what this government has provided for New Zealanders, where if they have a problem with Housing New Zealand, if they have a problem with WINS, if they have a problem with ACC, they sit and they wait, and they wait, and they wait on the 0800 number, and if they are lucky, they will get somebody on the end of the line. That's what this government... And does this government care about that? Does this government care about that? I don't think so. So they say that they're changing the way that the economy is run, and that they're changing the way the figures are controlled, but most of it is just moving things into things like 0800 call centres, so that basically the services of New Zealand are in decline. But Mr Speaker, they also seem to be very hypocritical, because on the one hand they say everyone must tighten their belts, everyone must cut.
Point of order. Mike Saban.
The member made reference of the word hypocritical.
No, he didn't. He said it was hypocritical.
Yeah.
Andrew Williams.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr. As I was saying, Mr Speaker, quite rightly, it is hypocritical of this government. It is hypocritical of this government to ask for everyday good New Zealanders to tighten their belts and make cuts and sacrifice services, while, for instance, the Department of the Prime Minister just balloons out in terms of the cost, just balloons out. From a relatively small staff under the former administration, look at the huge swell in numbers in the Prime Minister's department. I understand now there's floors and floors of people there servicing the Prime Minister. Hundreds of people to service a Prime Minister, basically, when in former administrations there were a fraction of that number. Large numbers of security guards and spooks that follow around behind the Prime Minister, even going to Hawaii on holiday with him. Even going to Hawaii. Now, who would even know who John Key is in Hawaii? Nobody would even know the man. No one would even recognise the man. He wouldn't even know. But no, he has to take his private spooks along, paid for by the New Zealand taxpayer, so that while he's lying around a swimming pool with his wife and children, while he's having a lovely time in Hawaii, he has to look important. And so when he goes down to the cafe and the coffee shop, he's got these guys with all these wires hanging out their ears so he can look important when he walks into the restaurant. So that if he might just happen to meet his mate Obama down at some restaurant, he can walk in with all his guys with the curly wires hanging out their ears. That's what this government's come to. It's all about face. It's all about putting on this big front. It's all about the smiley, happy, clappy stuff and looking good. It's all about Mr. Spray and walk away wanting to make a government look good. And meanwhile, Mr. Speaker, the very same person who holidays in Hawaii doesn't holiday in New Zealand, holidays in Hawaii, is a major shareholder in ski fields in the United States, not ski fields in New Zealand, major shareholder in ski fields in the United States, not New Zealand. Meanwhile, we watch our tourism in decline. We read this weekend where New Zealand is falling off the radar, where New Zealand is no longer seen as an attractive destination in many of our major markets, major tourism resource markets. Isn't that appalling? And yet that same gentleman, our Prime Minister, is the Minister of Tourism. Goodness knows why, because he said at the beginning when he became Minister of Tourism that he would use the influence of his office of Prime Minister to help improve tourism in this country. Well, it's been a failure. It's been a failure. Why have the Prime Minister as a Minister of Tourism with the results that he has achieved? Then, Mr. Speaker, and again, we were promised that this government would grow the pie and increase jobs, and they started off in the first year with a jobs summit in Auckland at the Telstra Clear Centre. A jobs summit that was going to bring all the CEOs and top brains from around New Zealand and grow the New Zealand economy and grow the jobs. And this jobs summit was going to grow. Well, what's it done? What's it done? Nothing. What's it done? There's more people now queuing up on unemployment than when that job summit was held. There are more people travelling across to Australia, 50,000 a year, than when that job summit was held. And just a short time before that, when John Key was the leader of the opposition and he stood in the Westpac Stadium in Wellington, and he said, and we all remember this, he said, I'm standing here in the Westpac Stadium which holds 35,000 people, and this is the number of people that are leaving every year to go to Australia, and when I become Prime Minister, I'm going to put a halt to that, he said. I'm going to put a halt to that. And we are going to reduce those numbers that are going to... Well, what's happened? What's happened? Eden Park, dead right. Eden Park holds 55,000 people, and now John Key can stand in the middle of Eden Park and he can say, under my watch, under my administration, 55,000 people a year now. So he can rightfully now stand in Eden Park. Mr. Speaker, it is appalling. We're seeing lip service from this government. We're seeing lip service from a failed administration that basically is not really doing things. They are attacking good aspects of New Zealand, left, right and centre. They are attacking, for instance, local government, something very dear to my heart. They are taking local government apart. They are really putting the boot into local government. Again, a quote from John Key when he was Leader of the Opposition. He said, in a speech to local government, we have to work in cooperation, because if this country is going to succeed and grow our infrastructure and grow our economy, we as central government have to work with local government. And what does this Prime Minister and this government do? They just continue to put the boot into local government, put the boot into the regions, put the boot into things like Mayor's Task Force for Jobs, put the boot into our education sector by dividing the education sector and trying to tear it apart. Left, right and centre, Mr. Speaker, this government is not doing well by this economy. We've seen the failure in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and how they tried to decimate our frontline services around the world. Our frontline service around the world they've tried to decimate. And, Mr. Speaker, it's not good enough. New Zealand First will continue to oppose many of these measures of this government because they're not good and they're not in the interests of everyday New Zealanders. And New Zealanders are waking up for this. They're seeing them selling out our country. They're seeing them selling the silverware, the power stations, the dams on the Waikato River, the dams in the Tongariro, the dams in the South Island. the geothermal stations around Taupo. They're seeing all these being sold out from under them, and New Zealanders are increasingly saying, we don't trust this government. Mr Speaker, there will be changes, and it will be coming in 2014.
I call Todd McLeay.
Mr Speaker, thank you. It's a pleasure to rise and speak in this debate.